Have you ever found yourself standing at the crossroads of a seemingly simple decision, perhaps what to wear, what to eat, or even which direction to take on a walk, and wondered, why did I choose that? What if I told you that many of the decisions we make every day are not as simple as they seem? They are, in fact, influenced by an intricate web of biases, mental shortcuts, and psychological processes that operate far beneath the surface of our conscious mind. Welcome to today's episode of Mindscapes, where we're about to unravel the mysteries behind the psychology of decision-making.
That's right, Daisy. Today's topic goes beyond the surface. We're not just talking about why you picked that coffee or why you chose a blue shirt instead of a red one. We're diving deep into the very mechanisms of the mind, into the forces that guide and sometimes misguide the choices we make. In this episode, we'll explore biases, mental shortcuts, and how decision-making is often shaped by factors we're not even aware of.
And here's where it gets interesting. We'll draw from some of the most fascinating studies in psychology, literature that's explored the complexity of human choice, and even films that shed light on how our minds operate when we think we're in control, when in fact we're not. From Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow, to the decision-making dilemmas in films like The Matrix, we'll challenge you to rethink everything you believe about how decisions are made.
By the end of this episode, you might find yourself questioning the very fabric of your own choices. Are you the master of your decisions, or are unseen forces pulling the strings? Stick with us, because what we're about to reveal may just change how you see yourself and your mind forever.
Let's start by thinking about what it means to make a decision. Most of us believe that decision-making is a rational process, one where we weigh options, consider the pros and cons, and then make the most logical choice. But here's the catch. Decades of psychological research show that's often far from the truth.
That's right. In fact, the work of Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky fundamentally changed how we understand decision-making. Their groundbreaking research showed that our brains operate in two distinct systems, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and emotional. It's the part of our mind that jumps to conclusions based on instinct. System 2, on the other hand, is slow, deliberate, and logical. It's the part that carefully analyzes information before reaching a conclusion.
Exactly. And here's where it gets fascinating. While we'd like to think that most of our decisions come from System 2, that slow, rational process, the truth is, much of our daily decision-making is driven by System 1. It's automatic, quick, and often based on patterns we've learned over time. This is where biases come in, mental shortcuts or heuristics that save us time and energy, but sometimes lead us astray.
It's like in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Raskolnikov believes he is making rational decisions, driven by logic and reason, as he contemplates murder. But as the novel unfolds, we see that much of his thinking is irrational, clouded by biases and subconscious fears. His decisions are not just a product of rational deliberation, but of the deeper, often hidden forces in his psyche.
Let's talk about cognitive biases, the silent influencers of our decision-making. These are systematic patterns of deviation from rationality. They're the mental traps that System 1 often falls into. One of the most well-known biases is the confirmation bias. It's when we tend to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, rather than looking for evidence that might contradict it.
It's almost as if our minds are rigged to make us feel right, even when we're wrong. Think of the last time you were in an argument. Did you actively seek out evidence that supported your point of view, ignoring anything that might prove you wrong? That's confirmation bias in action. It's also one of the reasons why political debates often seem like endless cycles. Each side only sees what reinforces their beliefs, filtering out everything else.
In Christopher Nolan's Inception, the concept of layers within the mind is brought to life. Just as the characters navigate dreams within dreams, we navigate layers of bias, sometimes completely unaware that we're operating within a distorted version of reality. Anchoring bias is another example. It's when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, like a number or suggestion, which then influences all subsequent decisions. You might notice this when you're bargaining or negotiating. The first price you hear, whether high or low, often anchors your expectations, even if it's arbitrary.
Exactly. It's fascinating how much our brains lean on these mental shortcuts. Another powerful one is the availability heuristic, our tendency to overestimate the importance of information that's readily available. For example, if you've just heard about a plane crash, you might overestimate the likelihood of being in one, even though statistically air travel remains one of the safest modes of transport.
Now, let's take a deeper look into how emotions play a crucial role in our decisions. We often think that emotions cloud our judgment, and in some cases they do. But emotions also serve as vital signals. They guide us, especially in uncertain situations. In Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, he argues that emotions are essential to rational decision-making. It's not about choosing logic over emotion. It's about understanding how the two interact.
Absolutely. Damasio's research shows that people with damage to the part of the brain responsible for emotion struggle to make even the simplest decisions. Without emotional signals, they become trapped in endless cycles of deliberation, unable to weigh the significance of different options. It's like being stuck in System 2 all the time, with no intuitive guidance from System 1.
Think of Hamlet, Shakespeare's quintessential figure of indecision. His paralysis comes from overthinking, his constant battle between logic and emotion. He weighs every option, every possible outcome, to the point where he becomes incapable of acting. His emotions, his fear, his grief, are suppressed under a mountain of rational deliberation, but the result is paralysis.
This brings us to a critical question for today's listener. How do we balance the emotional and rational sides of our decision-making? Is there ever truly a perfect balance, or are we destined to sway between the two? And more importantly, how do we recognize when our emotions are helping us and when they're leading us astray?
Now, let's take a moment to reflect on some vocabulary that shapes how we talk about decision-making. Words are powerful, and how we describe the process can influence how we understand it. Take the word deliberation. It comes from the Latin word deliberare, meaning to weigh. It conveys the image of carefully considering each option, but it also implies a certain slowness, a meticulous process.
Exactly. Contrast that with the word intuition, which derives from the Latin intuere, meaning to look inside. It suggests something far more immediate, something that comes from within, without the need for lengthy consideration. It's fascinating how these words reflect the very processes we've been discussing. Deliberation as the hallmark of System 2, intuition the defining characteristic of System 1.
And then there's bias, from the old Provençal word biais, meaning slant or slope. It suggests a leaning, a deviation from straight thinking. The very word reminds us that biases are not inherently malicious. They are simply the mind's way of taking shortcuts, even if those shortcuts lead us off course.
That's a great point, Daisy. And perhaps we need to reframe our relationship with bias. Rather than seeing it as something inherently bad, we can start to view it as a mechanism, one that needs to be understood and managed. After all, biases are part of being human. They're our mind's way of navigating a complex world.
So, how can we take all this fascinating theory and apply it to our daily lives? One way is to become more aware of when System 1 is in control. When you find yourself making a decision quickly, ask yourself, am I acting out of habit, emotion, or bias? Sometimes it's useful to slow down and engage System 2, especially in decisions that have long-term consequences.
Absolutely. Another practical tip is to seek out contradictory information. We talked about confirmation bias earlier. To counter it, make a habit of actively looking for evidence that challenges your beliefs. This not only improves your decision-making, but also sharpens your critical thinking skills.
And finally, remember the role of emotion. Don't ignore it, but don't let it rule your decisions either. Acknowledge how you feel, then ask yourself how those feelings are influencing your choices. Sometimes, simply being aware of your emotions is enough to prevent them from steering you in the wrong direction.
So, are we truly the masters of our own decisions, or are we subject to hidden forces, biases, shortcuts, and emotional undercurrents that guide our every choice? The answer, as with most things in life, is complicated. But by understanding how these forces work, we can become better, more thoughtful decision-makers.
We've covered a lot today, from the cognitive biases that cloud our judgment to the interplay between logic and emotion, to the very vocabulary we use to describe decision-making. The path to better decision-making starts with awareness, and hopefully, today, we've shed some light on that path.
So, the next time you face a decision, big or small, remember this conversation. Question your instincts, challenge your biases, and, most importantly, be kind to yourself. After all, decision-making is as much an art as it is a science.
And on that note, we'll leave you to reflect. Thank you for joining us today on this deep dive into the psychology of decision-making. Keep questioning, keep reflecting, and remember, there's always more to discover.
Until next time, stay curious and keep making those mindful decisions.